everyone, this is Rebecca Arvin-Colon with the Water Environment Federation. I want to welcome each of you to the WEF MS4 Survey and Dashboard Stormwater Data Coming Alive webcast. Before we begin, I would like to quickly review a few logistics. During this webcast, while you cannot speak directly to the presenters, you will have an opportunity to submit questions by typing your specific question into the GoToWebinar pane that appears on the right-hand side of your computer screen. We're going to be doing things a little bit differently today because I know we're all suffering from Zoom and webcast fatigue. Please feel free to submit your questions, comments, and thoughts at any time throughout the webcast into the questions box. We'll be monitoring these and incorporate them into the program when we can. We'll be recording this webcast. The recording link will be available on the Stormwater Institute website 24 hours after the webcast has ended. Please note that PDH credits are not available for this event. If you have any additional questions after the webcast has ended, please email me at rarvin@wef.org. Thank you to everyone that filled out the webcast registration questions. This allows us to tailor the webcast to meet your needs as well as inform future surveys. I thought you might be interested to see the compiled information. A large portion of the registrants are either somewhat familiar or not familiar with the MS4 survey or the dashboard. We appreciate you signing up for the webcast to learn more about it, and we hope the webcast provides you some context of the results and how they can be useful to you. A large portion of the registrants are also unsure if they responded or didn't respond to the 2018 and 2020 MS4 surveys. A big thank you to those of you that did respond because this wouldn't be possible without you. We'll be doing the survey again next year, so hopefully those of you that didn't fill out the survey, we can encourage you to do so next time. I mentioned that we're going to be doing things a little bit differently today. These are our speakers for today's event. We're going to start with Seth Brown, WEF Stormwater Institute Senior Advisor and National Municipal Stormwater Alliance's Executive Director. Seth is going to be going over the MS4 survey background, methodology, and then some of the big results, takeaways, and conclusions. Matthew Jones, Associate Vice President and Stormwater Practice Group Leader with Hazen & Sawyer, and Jason Yoho, Chief Commercial Officer with Second Nature Software, will then join Seth for a discussion about the broader value of the survey. Feel free to add your comments, questions in the chat here. Matthew, Jason, and Seth will all be monitoring the questions box and can answer your questions and include your thoughts in this discussion. After the discussion, Jason will tell us a little bit more about Second Nature, and then pass it over to Tyler Nodine, Senior Scientist with Second Nature, to give us a demo of the MS4 survey dashboard. Feel free to ask questions about the dashboard here, and Tyler can answer them. Then Tyler Carson, Stormwater and Green Infrastructure Senior Engineer with Arcadis, will tell us about some additional analysis that he has been able to do with the survey budget information and how it may be useful to MS4 communities. We'll finish up the webcast by answering any remaining questions you may have. We'll also do some polls throughout the webcast, and there will be a survey that launches after you close out of the webcast. Your participation in these polls and the survey is really helpful for us to continue to learn what's useful to you and how we can continue to improve the survey. Thank you again for participating in today's webcast, and thank you to our speakers for your preparation for the webcast. Seth, I'll hand it over to you.
All right. Thanks, Rebecca. And as soon as I get control. All right. Okay, I think everybody can see my screen now. Well, thanks, Rebecca, for that intro and for setting all of this up. Thanks to WEF for hosting this. My name is Seth Brown. I'm the Executive Director of the National Municipal Stormwater Alliance. And I'm going to be giving kind of a broad overview of the needs assessment survey, and as well as looking at some of the results and conclusions. This is, this is going to be a very quick and kind of macro scale discussion. There's a lot more detail that's available, and you're going to hear about some of this as we go through these different discussions. So I'm going to be doing the big picture. Don't think that this is a comprehensive discussion of this at all. So I also wanted to take a minute to thank everybody who has been involved and participated in either one of the 2018 or 2020 surveys. We wouldn't be doing this if folks didn't take the time to do that. We greatly appreciate that, and we hope that you continue to to stay engaged in future surveys. So they're very valuable, and hopefully through this discussion, you'll understand why this has been so helpful for us. So quickly, the overview of what I'll be presenting. I'm going to give some background information very briefly about what it is, what the survey is about, how many we've done, as well as what is the what's the purpose, what's the value of this. Talk about some data and methods. I'm not going to get into great detail. Again, there's a lot more information, and you're going to see how we can use that data in creative ways in the following presentations subsequent to my discussion. I'll talk a little bit about some basic results, and then finally have some kind of big picture takeaways and conclusions and considerations for future efforts. Okay, so background information. Again, there's a lot more background to this, but the bottom line is this: that we have there's been 2 surveys so far, 2018 and 2020. Both have been statistically significant, which is really important. It shows that we can talk with great confidence about the results that we've had in both surveys, and we're seeing an increase in participation. I'll show you some information on that. So the purpose overall is to highlight what are the needs and challenges that MS4s face, and also we need to understand any funding. And we'll show some of the results. And I think this is something that most of you who are here will have a sense of, or have some appreciation of, is funding is the most significant topic in our sector. And so we wanted to understand, what are those existing budgets, what's an estimate of those existing budgets, and what is that funding gap? That is in terms of advocacy and other types of efforts at the national level. Having that information is crucial. So that's another purpose for this. So why do we do these surveys? Why was this started a couple of years ago? And why has it continued? Well, there's just lack this data. There's, the water sector is data poor, generally speaking. And again, I think when Second Nature folks get on here, they can talk about the significance of data and the growth of data in this sector. But as it is right now, the water sector is data poor, and the stormwater sector within that context is probably the poorest of all. We're just more nascent, lower funded, all of those reasons that we've got less data. So getting more data like this is really critical. So that's an important reason. This has never been done before. Something at this scale, at a national level, had never been done before. So again, hats off to WEF for doing this and showing this leadership and making this happen. And you'll see some of the great things that have come from this. So it's the first of a kind effort, and it's difficult to do this. There's a reason that hasn't been done before, but we're showing that all of us are showing that this is something that is not only possible to do once, but it's repeatable. And that's another important thing to think about. So that's the background. I also want to recognize all the volunteers that have been involved. I want to recognize the staff, of course. Rebecca Arvin Colon has been leading this on the MS4, or on the WEF side of things. And of course, Adriana Caldarelli, the leadership of the Stormwater Institute. We have a lot of folks involved here, and we've got some of those folks here are actually part of the presentation, so you hear from them. So what you're seeing here is a snapshot of a lot of hands putting in a lot of work. So I just want to make sure that we all appreciate that and understand that. So I'll go over some of the, again, there's a lot of detail that we could go into on this, but that's not really the point of this. You can take your time to dig into the data. You can read through the report. It has discussion about the data and the methods. And of course, if you have any questions, you can ask them here, or you can ask them after we're done here as well, and follow up. So just real quickly, what's the size and the nature of the survey itself? Is 31 total questions that fall into 4 different buckets. The first is organization information. What's the permittee type? Those are the critical questions. There was a lot of other details in here, but the really important stuff was, are we talking about phase 1s, phase 2s, not traditional, state, DOT, primarily with the buckets that we talked about. And then we also looked at population size. We've looked at different bins, and I'll talk a little bit about that, and you'll hear a little bit more about that from Tyler Carson's presentation at the end today. So that was the first section, just to understand what's the organization profile. Second is, what are the challenges and those needs? what are the topics of the greatest interest and the greatest challenge? That's what we were trying to capture with that. So there's a series of questions about we're not going to get to all those topics here today. The third is really, again, we talked about funding and budgetary information. This is really something that's really critical. Not that everything else isn't, but the fact that we have better information on this than we have in the past is really helpful. So we wanted to put that in here and dedicate a section to that. And the last section is open-ended. And it was great how many, again, folks who were involved, who participated. We went through all of these, believe me, and there was a lot of great information and great insights that came through on areas, things such as innovation, what's working, what's not, what are the most and least developed areas in the programs, and also the sufficiency of the national program. We'll talk a little bit about some of these points as we go through. As far as responses, it's always good to know, we threw this survey out there, all these questions, we promoted it. WEF, of course, promoted it. NMSA, my organization, promoted it, and others. And you can see I've included the 2018 information. I'm not gonna go to that very often, but I wanted to show that we had over 600 responses in 2018, and we had over 800 this time, and we saw growth in responses from all of the permittee types, which is really the way that we're looking at this data. So, and the distribution was very similar. So we got consistent types of breakdown. We didn't get a lot more of one versus the other, and we saw growth overall. That's great, and we hope and expect to continue to see this type of growth in the future. Maybe next time we'll see 1,000, and then so on and so on. It's really getting started was the tough part, but now we've got some momentum, and having events like this are really helpful this way. And you see that we had responses from 47 states, including DC and Puerto Rico. And I think even one or more to beyond that too. So we have good responses. And looking at this in the context of regions, we we looked at EPA regions. That's about as granular as we got spatially for various reasons. If you look at the percentage of all MS4 permittees by region, that's the far right column there. If you compare that to the percentage of survey respondents, so of the total survey respondents, that pool, you can see the distribution there. There's a lot of similarities here. A lot of it ties in very closely. There's some that are a little bit overrepresented, some that are a little bit underrepresented, but overall, it reflects regionally the MS4 programs across the country, and that was something again that was important. If we had all other responses bunched in one corner of the country, this would not have a lot of validity in the context of a national effort. And when we went through the challenges and needs area, what we did to boil everything down, we took the Likert style. So basically 1 to 5, do I agree or disagree? One in that spectrum across 1 to 5. Took all those and boiled it down to a weighted average ranking. So that's how we ranked the responses that we received. We also looked at those that provided really high agreement, over 50% that all agreed that this is a significant need, for instance. And we'll look at some of those responses, those results here. And you can see just some of the topics that were covered on the challenges side as well as the needs side. So we talked about funding, as we talked about funding, aging infrastructure, expanding regulations, and on the needs side, looked at things such as, again, funding and financing, of course, asset management, watershed based and NMS4 programming and planning. So, but there's a lot more than this, and you could dig in a lot deeper if you go download the survey for free at the WEF site, and I know that link is going to be provided. So, okay, so some quick results. Again, there's so much more we get into, but I'm just trying to do a quick snapshot so we can have more discussion here. In the budgetary, I'm starting with budget because this is such an important and critical piece of information. And what we did was, and we'll talk a little bit about methodology. We don't have a whole lot of time, but we'll talk a little bit about it. What we found is that we found an average amount of existing budget. So in that the left side, upper left-hand side, the average annual budget by permittee type. Then we asked, are there additional monies being spent? I think probably a lot of folks realize that you have here's my budget year to year, plus or minus, depending if you've got a stormwater utility or you've got general funds, but you probably have a relatively consistent budget. But then every now and then you get maybe a grant or something else comes through that supplements your budget. So we try to capture that on that upper right-hand side, additional monies being spent. If you put that all together and you look at a low and a high end range, we found a takeaway here or a result here is that the estimate based upon this information for the total MS4 budgets across the entire country, all combined, is between 18 and $24 billion. That's, again, having that scale, now we have some kind of understanding is how big is our sector really in terms of the investments that are made annually. Again, that's very helpful in the context of advocacy and working with regulators and Congress as well. So then the next question is, okay, we know we have some information about existing budgets. Now we have to think about what are the additional needs. That's the funding gap that we're getting to. And I wanted to highlight the fact that we looked at, we asked the questions, yes, no, and there's a fair amount of those who just didn't answer, just left this question blank. And it's just interesting to note, and you can see bold in there, 3 of the 4 permittee types, and really the more significant, because non-traditional is a smaller group, they're less formalized. All 3 of those phase 1, phase 2, and DOTs all had over 50% agreed that they have additional funding needs. That's what this question is asking. Beyond that, if you just look at, if you were to cover that up on your screen, cover up the yeses and the null, and then the nulls, look at the no's. The no's are relatively low. You know, they're 28, 29% pretty consistently. So this is really, it shows, and this is actually higher than it was in the previous survey. So I think we're seeing a growing understanding of the significance and the urgency of additional needs for funding. And again, something we all sense, but it's great to be able to point to something credibly that tells us that. We looked at this specific information, boiled it down by average permittee type, and we did an estimate. I'll talk about real quickly about how we did that. But we found an estimated annual funding gap of $8.5 billion. So if you put that $8.5 billion in the context of what we found budgetary, the annual budgets across the country, that represents between a third and a half. I mean, that's a significant funding gap compared to what we already spend. It's not just 5% additional. We need significant funds beyond what we have for those who identify that they have a funding need that goes beyond what they have. This is again a significant funding, or a significant finding, I should say. As far as funding gap analysis, again, there's a lot of details we can get into here. We use 2 different methods. We use the very simple one, which is basically, let's look at the permittee type, which is all the information we've shown so far in that context. And we said, you know, the permit, phase 1s, there are this many phase 1s, this percentage said they identified they needed additional funds. Extrapolate that all out, and you get a number. Then we looked at a more nuanced or complex methodology, which was I talked about, up front we asked about information about the organizations and the municipalities that and the permittees who provided information up front, organizational information. And so we looked at the bins, less than 10,000 people, 10 to 50,000, 50 to 100,000, so on. And if you take that and do an analysis, and you have to make some adjustments because the way that the MS4s are out there, some are cities, some are counties. So they're grouped a little bit differently across the country. If you do, and again, this is all very detailed in the report, so I suggest go check that out if you want to learn some more about that. But basically, we made adjustments to make this to reflect the MS4 universe as much as possible. And we did both of those methods, and they came up with very similar numbers. And that's why we knew, okay, this is a consistent figure. You're going to hear from a subsequent discussion here another kind of check on this too, to show that, yeah, these numbers make sense. They're in the ballpark of what we would expect in something that's realistic. Some quick results here. We looked at, again, challenges was one of the major issues we want to look at. So we did the ranking. You can see in the lower left-hand corner, those are the rankings based upon the weighted numbers and ranks that were provided. Aging infrastructure was at the very top overall. And then of course funding and increased and expanding regulations as far as challenges. And you can see in that bar charts there, those are the percentages that identified significant needs here for those different. So you can see again, aging infrastructure is really a significant need for phase 1s as an example. And this is broken down by, again, the 4 different types of permittees that we are involved in. So there's a couple outliers. Cross-department coordination for state DOTs is a significant need. That kind of makes sense since they have to, focus a lot of their efforts on working with municipalities that are in their areas when they're doing work across different jurisdictions and watersheds. So this is just one snapshot. There's a lot more that's out there, and we can get into that more. You can read into that more when you get a chance. We also asked, what are your needs? Again, so that's what WEF does. They develop content through products, publications, courses, trainings, and of course, WEF Tech and other types of events like that. So it's good to know, what is it that you need in the sector to move forward? So again, funding and financing, top need. How could we learn more about that and to get more funding and or use our funds and financing in smarter, better ways? Asset management, which is a topic that's on the rise, that was a significant topic, and so is watershed-based and stormwater planning. These are the interesting. So again, there's a lot more out there. I'm just kind of trying to go through this again because we need to set this up for the discussion. A couple other interesting findings is that we asked how many have stormwater asset management plans, and we found, look pretty consistently across these different permittee types, about 50% identified, yeah, we do have an asset management plan. We didn't ask about what type, what does it look like, just is it a yes, no, it's a toggle. And then 10% were unsure. So that's an interesting finding, we thought. We also asked the question, do you think the overall federal stormwater program is sufficient? That's a loaded term potentially, because it means, what is sufficient to you means it might be something that's different to me. And it's sufficient to meet clean water goals in the long term. And it's just interesting, again, that we saw pretty consistent responses through all these different permittee types. And we looked at regions as well, regions 3, 5, and 9, for instance, for EPA. And we saw about a third between yes, no, and I'm not sure. It's hard to really understand what that means. It might mean that, hey, we just think that we need to do more in our programs, our federal programs. Or maybe it means that the goals of the communities, flooding and resilience, aren't really well tied into the clean water goals. So maybe that's what there's a disconnect there. Maybe this is an area that we could do some more digging around. So real quickly, some conclusions, takeaways, next steps. I just want things to walk away with real quickly. First is this, this survey is statistically significant. That's a big thing. That's really helpful to know, and it helps us speak with more confidence on these results. We had higher response rates. Again, we had more responses, which is great. We expect to see more in the future. We had higher rates of identified needs. More folks said, yes, we do need additional funds. That's a big issue. And of course, we came up with estimates for existing budgets as well as the funding gap. Those are kind of the black and white conclusions. But there are some other things to think about. The first of which is, this survey helped to enable, for the first time ever, ASCE in their infrastructure report card includes stormwater. They didn't have this funding gap information. They didn't have this information across the sector. So again, WEF made this happen. So this is the biggest takeaway. If there's anything else that you remember, this is the thing to remember. A couple other things: aging infrastructure and funding and financing are huge. We see aging infrastructure is a growing issue, especially for phase ones. Half the programs have asset management plans. That means half don't, probably. So there's a need there moving forward. And we talked about there's no clear consensus on the sufficiency of the National Stormwater Program, but we don't know what that means. So that's an area that we need to focus on. And lastly, I wanted to mention that we're going to hear about this data dashboard. Actually, the next discussion is going to be about this. So you can take all this information I talked about and you can look at it in regional context. You can slice the data any way you want, which is really, really helpful, and it gets you guys more involved with the data. And that's really what this is all about. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to put up this slide, but we're going to get to this in a second. I think you've got some poll questions, or a poll question, I believe, Rebecca. That's right.
Yes, I'm going to launch the first poll question here. So it's, what role do you see this meaning the survey, providing in the work that you do? Looks like we have about 40% so far, so I'll just leave it open for a couple more seconds. 50%.
Yeah. And if you enter other, feel free to put in use the questions feature to note what role you see it providing in the work that you do.
Yes, good point, Matthew. All right, looks like the responses have stopped coming in, so I will close that out and then show the responses. So interesting. Understanding how my MS4 is similar or different, and then support outreach.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. One of the things that I think we're all excited about with this report is that there are a variety of uses and ways that it can be. As Seth mentioned, there hasn't really, prior to the two iterations of this survey, there haven't necessarily been similar efforts to really capture the breadth of MS4 needs and efforts nationally. And so with that, there's a lot of great information. We'll get into some detail about some dashboarding that allows us to dig into some more detail there. But yeah, really a broad array of uses for that. And I think the poll responses kind of reflect that. Different folks have different needs and interests. We've got some questions coming in with some that selected other. Let's see, some of it is understanding. Sorry, I'm trying to.
One thing I see, Matthew, is there's one that says just that not enough funding is not just a local problem, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point, and that's one of the things that is really interesting. Everybody has kind of their operating under the Clean Water Act, but different aspects of their local program, and so some of that is knowing that you're not alone in the challenges that you're facing, and that others so there's some benefit in just knowing that and being able to communicate that to others. As well as, one of the survey responses a number of people responded is, knowing their opportunities to collaborate with others. I think that was one of the things that was interesting. Many similar challenges across MS4s. Seth talked about aging infrastructure, other things. So, looking to share some of those best practices and collaborate with others on how best to tackle some of these challenges.
Yeah. Yeah. So, one thing that I wanted to, there's a lot that we could talk about. A couple things that we thought we'd want to touch on is, this kind of helps us transition, I think, Jason, to the next phase of the discussion, is how can this survey and the data associated with it, and this output, how can this be a practical tool for MS4s?
Yeah.
You work a lot with local MS4s, especially in data intense issues. Any thoughts on that, Jason?
Yeah, it is really interesting, Seth, and I appreciate your presentation as well, and Matthew, your comments I think are very relevant. From being a second nature, and I'll do a little bit of an intro in a few minutes, but as you mentioned, we're working with permit holders primarily, and we all know our industry, there's a lot of variability in terms of the permits and what they're focused on, and how the different permit holders are kind of approaching their programs. But I think the survey, of course, part of the value is in validating the obvious, right? That, and we're all focused on kind of this gap from a funding perspective, but I think it also contextualizes and provides a very useful tool for individual programs as they're trying to build out their business cases and showing how their individual program compares to what's happening in their state and their region and nationally, right? Those are very valid data points to come forward with and say, here's kind of the situational analysis of where our program is. And I think that we've seen that the survey, I even mentioned this, I think, on our call earlier this week, that the survey is actually being used pretty heavily that way, we found. And if you're a permit holder on the call and you're not doing that, I would encourage you to rely on it as a resource to help make your business case, both internally and with your partners at the state level, around what the priorities are for your program. So we've seen it used in a daily kind of practical sense that way, and I think that's a very powerful and helpful tool.
Yeah, I think that whole thing about how do we compare to others, because we're all, MS4 program managers are, do day to day doing their thing. It's hard to look up and look across, and hopefully this can help to provide that context. So, Matthew, real quickly, I want to, if you don't mind, I want to go to that second point about resilience, because we didn't. It's a big topic these days, right? But we didn't really get into that and as much in the survey. Do you want to? I know that you were involved. Do you have any thoughts about that and how it's kind of fragmented throughout, and what we can kind of take away on that?
Yeah, no, it's a great point, Seth, and that's something that as we, all of us that were involved in kind of the survey, as we're at conferences talking with different localities, we perceived that we were hearing more and more about that, and that wasn't something that we picked up heavily in the survey, and that is something that will be interesting to see both through. There's a variety of reasons why we've talked about that may be the case, and perhaps we can talk through some of those during the course of the webcast here today. But that's also something we'd be curious to hear from you all, either through the chat features and all here or afterwards, if that's a major driver for your program and something that you'd like to see more of. One key point I think related to that, and again, we're limited in the survey in terms of how we're intentionally limited how much inferences we draw from some of the results, because we have the responses to the questions and we can't read the minds of everyone that responded. But some of the things, aging infrastructure, Seth mentioned is really a high interest. Certainly that pairs up and can be kind of a risk multiplier with some of the climate resiliency and climate change needs that we see. So that's something that we're certainly interested to explore more, and would certainly be eager to hear from those participating today, your views on that topic.
Yeah, I mean, it was a challenge, as going through this, being part of the work team. You want to add more questions. If we took all the questions we wanted, if we'd have 300 questions instead of 30, but obviously there's got to be a balance between what's practical and what do we need. So, and we tried to not tweak too much between these surveys so we can have a longitudinal understanding of the rise and fall of certain topics. So it's a challenge. So, and this is one of those things that maybe we'll tweak a little bit in the future, who knows, but it'd be interesting to hear from folks if that is, because if we see strong need, then maybe that's something that will be tweaked. So, Jason, I don't know if you want to transition to the next phase of what we're talking about here. I'll turn my camera off.
Yeah, very much. Thank you for the discussion, and thank you, of course, Rebecca and WEF and everybody for inviting Second Nature to be a continuing partner in the survey. We're very excited about that. I thought maybe I'd just take a second. We want to show you the dashboard that we built. It's a dynamic tool, and Tyler from Second Nature, who was really on point for helping build that dashboard, is going to do a demo of that here in just a minute. But leading up to that, I thought I would take a second to talk a little bit about Second Nature and kind of who we are and what our perspective is on the stormwater industry, and really why we're so excited to be participating in the survey. So Second Nature is a software company that makes a cloud-based platform for MS4 program management and compliance automation. We're an early stage technology company based in Santa Cruz, California, and with customers in over 13 states and over $5 billion worth of stormwater assets being managed by our platform now, we're the fastest growing enterprise software company in the stormwater industry. Our mission is to use the power of the cloud and geographic information systems to get a dynamic, science-informed information basis into your hands as MS4 program managers and regulators, to help with programmatic decision making. So we have a core competency not just in stormwater, but also in big data. And the stormwater industry, as we've touched on, of course, is rapidly changing, evolving, and the infrastructure funding announcements and environmental equity plans of the Biden administration are examples of some of the macro factors that are influencing and accelerating our industry. And so the highly distributed nature of stormwater assets in our industry, combined with the reporting requirements around the permit, make data centralization really important to understanding priorities. So that's really the basis for our interest in Second Nature in participating in the survey. And as Seth often says, as stormwater matures and really gains a seat at the adult table in the water world, having a comprehensive understanding of priorities and the status of the industry is invaluable. kind of across the board. So with that, we're going to pause for a second, and we're going to do another survey. Rebecca's going to put up the survey, and then I'm going to introduce Tyler Nodine, who's a senior scientist at Second Nature, and he's going to take us through the dashboard itself.
Thanks, Jason. I just launched that second poll. It's just asking if you use dashboards. Are you familiar with other dashboards? I know, during the beginning of the pandemic, I used several different coronavirus dashboards, so they are handy. So just asking in general if you use dashboards. Great. We already have 60% of folks voted. So I will go ahead and close that out and share the results. So it looks like we have about 55% are familiar with dashboards, sometimes use them. Great. Thank you. I'll pass it over to you, Tyler.
Hi there. Thanks, Rebecca, and thank you, Seth and Jason, for setting the stage. I'm going to leave my camera off for now in order to, while I'm doing this dashboard demo, just to conserve bandwidth and so that we can focus on the dashboard itself. So again, I'm Tyler Nodine from Second Nature Software, and I'm going to give a demo of the MS4 Needs Assessment Survey dashboard. And hopefully this can showcase its functionality to you all and highlights some of the value it can provide to users. So you should all see on the screen the data dashboard live right now. So it's great to hear that some people in the audience have some experience with dashboards. This dashboard is currently live and accessible through the WEF Stormwater Institute.org, and there'll be links provided to the dashboard directly. And if anyone would like to log on to the dashboard and follow along with the demo at home, I encourage you to do so. So starting with the basics, a data dashboard is a tool that's used to convey a large amount of information on a single screen using location-based analytics and interactive data visualizations. Dashboards like this one give users the ability to slice and dice the data in customized ways to answer questions that are relevant specifically to them. As has been discussed in Seth's presentation, there's a lot of information captured in the 2018 and 2020 MS4 surveys, and not all of that can be conveyed in static reports. So the data dashboard provides a great tool for users to explore the findings of the survey in a more detailed and customized way. So I'm going to start with a general overview of what's included in the dashboard, and then I'm going to go through the data panels in more detail through the lens of a specific MS4 program manager. So looking at the dashboard, on the left, we've included information on the survey background and response rates. And for any of these data panels, you can click on the expand button in the upper right-hand corner to zoom in on figures. So in this map of survey response rates, if we expand the legend, we can see response counts for the different EPA regions. And then if we expand the layers view, we can also toggle between looking at 2020 response counts as well as 2018 response counts to see how response rates differed between the two surveys. So closing out of that, we also have response rate shown by permittee type. We see 67% of respondents were of phase 2 MS4s. And then we have more survey background information where there's links to the full report. The rest of the dashboard follows the structure of the survey itself, which Seth described in some detail earlier. So in the middle pane, we show data from the questions related to program challenges and drivers. And then on the right, we have information from the resource needs and funding questions, as well as some additional program questions in the bottom right. A key feature I also want to bring to attention now is the filter options that are up here at the top of the dashboard. These menus let users, will let you filter survey data by the survey year, by EPA region, and by MS4 permit type. And as you select these features, you can see the data change in real time. So if I click on the 2018 button, I can see results from the 2018 survey. I can select to see data from across the country or a specific EPA region. And then I can also look at different permit types. So I can switch between phase 1, or if I just want to look at phase 2 responses, I can do that. These filter tools can help highlight how MS4 program challenges, drivers, and funding needs vary across the country, and sort of to the points from the polls earlier, can help programs better understand how they compare with other similar programs in their region and across the country. And another thing I want to note now is that even with the data filtering functionality we have in the dashboard, we still took great care to make sure that the dashboard keeps all survey respondents 100% anonymous. Okay, so next I'm going to walk through the data panels in a little bit more detail through the lens of a specific stormwater program to again try to show how we can gain insight and value from the dashboard and see how different regions and permit types compare to one another. So let's say I'm a program manager of a phase 2 MS4 program in Michigan, which is in EPA region 5. So I'm already selected here on EPA region 5 and looking at phase 2 MS4 permittee types. So with these filters in the lower left-hand corner, we have, and let's look at the current 2020 responses. So in the lower left, we have the number of survey responses for active filters. So we can see there was 146 respondents that were of phase 2 type in EPA region 5. So it's a fairly robust sample size for this group. We also have shown the estimated population served by programs under the active filters. So if I switch between, switch to the other tab down here, we can see that 10 million people are estimated to be served by those 146 programs that we're looking at here. Okay, let's look at some of the survey response data now. In the center panel, we show top MS4 programs and challenges, which Seth touched on earlier. And as was described before, participants were asked to specify which factors in the list here pose the strongest challenges to their program. And for Region 5, Phase 2 MS4s, we see aging infrastructure and funding and availability of capital come out at the top, as well as increasing and expanding regulations. And we can compare this with the national responses. And if we recall from Seth's slides, it aligns pretty well with what we're seeing across the country. Similarly, we can see how maybe some of these challenges have changed over time since 2018. But again, see sort of the same challenges rise to the top. Similarly, we can look at drivers of MS4 planning. So on the second tab here for Region 5, Phase 2 MS4s, we see a list of sort of the top drivers that programs indicated for planning and investment decisions. So again, we see aging infrastructure come out at the top, as well as water quality being an important driver. If we compare this with another region, say Region 7, adjacent EPA Region 7, we see water quality becomes less common driver for programs, and land development seems to be a much more important factor. Okay, next let's look at survey responses specific to resource needs and funding. This is the panel in the upper right. So when asked what were the top areas of information and resource needs, again, we see funding and financing rise to the top. And let's switch back to our study case, looking at Region 5, again, Phase 2 MS4s. And yes, we still see funding and financing rise to the top. And in this panel, and as with most panels, we have several tabs stacked on top of each other. So when using the dashboard, I want to remind everyone to check out the stacked charts that are included. So if we flip to the next tab, we see the proportion of participants who indicated having an annual funding gap. And for, again, Region 5, for our study case, we see that in 2018, just less than 50% indicated an annual funding gap. And in 2020, we see well over 50%. So an interesting, notable increase there. If we flip to tab 3, this is the estimated average annual program budget that was reported. So at $984,000, we see that the Region 5 Phase 2 MS4s fall slightly below the national average for Phase 2 MS4s at $1.4 million. And if we flip to the fourth tab in this stack, we see the reported annual funding shortfall or budget gap. So that comes at $1 million for EPA Region 5 Phase 2. And again, we can compare this with national average and then different permittee types. So comparing with Phase 1, we see Phase 1 programs tend to have larger budgets and larger budget gaps associated with those. So finally, I want to touch on the last panel down here on the bottom right. These are some additional program questions that Seth alluded to earlier and described some of them in more detail. So we have questions like, does your program use watershed-based stormwater planning? Do you have a stormwater asset management plan? Do you have TMDL requirements as part of your permit? How are resources allocated in your program? And what are your views on the federal stormwater program's efficiency? So that covers all the data panels that are included in the dashboard. And I wanted to reiterate what Seth highlighted earlier, that these surveys are the first of their kind, and we're happy to be able to provide a tool to help people dive deeper into their findings. We hope that the dashboard can help users better understand the stormwater sector and how they compare to other programs. And we definitely invite you to visit the dashboard and explore more on your own. And we also encourage you to sign up for future surveys to help out with these efforts. In the bottom middle of the dashboard, there's an orange button, and if you click on that, that will send you to an online form where if you fill in your information, you'll be added to a list, and we'll let you know when the future surveys come out and how you can participate. So thank you everyone for tuning in. And I believe we have a few more poll questions that Rebecca is going to pose.
Thank you so much, Tyler. That was great. Yes, a couple more poll questions. I'll launch the next one here. It is, how often do you anticipate using or referencing the survey report or the data dashboard? And while you all are filling that out, we did have a couple of questions that came in as you were presenting, Tyler.
Great. Yeah, happy to try to answer them if they're applicable.
Yeah, Tyler, one question that came through is, what percentage of the population is represented in the survey response? which I think you touched on. The dashboard maybe doesn't present as a percentage, but does present the total population served by the respondents.
Yeah, I couldn't tell you offhand what the percentage is, but if we look at, again, all regions, all respondent types, we see a estimated population served of 130.5 million. So yeah, pretty large representation here.
Yeah, no, great. And that's one of the things, and Seth shared some information on the types of respondents. And I know, phase 1 MS4, so the larger MS4s, we had over 20% of total MS4s respond to the survey. So altogether, a decent proportion, certainly not everyone, but a decent proportion of the total population. We had another question here, and Rebecca or Seth, you may be able to answer this. Are we able to use these graphics in research and reports, etc.?
Yeah, so that was one thing I forgot to touch on. Yeah, we have, actually the best way to use them is to take screenshots. So get into the dashboard, set up the charts how you'd like them, and you can easily take screenshots of the charts and plug them into reports and slides. So yeah, highly encourage that for communication.
Great, thanks, Tyler. Another question about some of the details of the technical aspect. Is this dashboard available for download via the Esri Solutions Center?
The dashboard, it's housed online, so it's available through the online link, and it is hosted by Esri, but I don't think there's a need to download it locally.
Yeah, it's, and as Tyler mentioned, and I think the link is in the chat, it is available online, and it's, broadly publicly accessible to access there. Thanks, Tyler. Next question we had is are the annual budget needs available on a per capita basis or some normalized amount by population?
It's a great question. That's not included in the dashboard, but I think Tyler Carson is going to touch more on that topic.
Yes, stay tuned a little bit longer in the webcast, and Tyler will be digging into some more details on the budget information. And the last question we have in right now is, do the respondents get a report of their responses when completing the survey? Rebecca or Seth, that may be a question you can help answer. I can't recall.
Yeah, I can take that one on. If a specific MS4 would like to see their responses for their specific response for the survey, I'd be happy to share that with you. As Matthew mentioned earlier, we're really kind of protective of the data. We want to make sure that everyone's responses are kept anonymous, so we do not provide any of the raw data to anyone. But if you're an individual MS4 looking for your own responses, I'd be happy to work with you.
Great, thank you for all the good questions. And Tyler, I had one more question before we move along. And certainly, feel free others to kind of chime in with the chat as you think of other questions. But I know it's a lot of really great information, a lot of really great functionality provided by the dashboard. Anything and I know you shared some good examples, but anything that jumped out especially as kind of interesting or a helpful feature that stood out to you in the course of looking at this?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say any one thing, but I've spent a long time just flipping through the different questions and flipping through the different filter options and comparing by different EPA regions how various challenges and drivers are different across the country. I find that interesting, and there's a lot to sort of dissect there.
Hey, Matthew, this is Seth. I wanted to just clarify one thing. I'm sorry to pop up. Tyler, the different the color schemes that's used on the map for the different regions, that doesn't have any. That's not tied to any kind of measurable output. That's just a way to differentiate regions. Is that correct?
Oh, the colors indicate the number of respondents from that region.
Okay.
So darker blues are more respondents. It's just a way to quickly at a glance get a sense for where more responses are coming from.
Thank you.
And then we had one more question that came in. Does a similar dashboard tool exist for the individual program level, for example, to explore progress towards metrics? And I guess if by program level that's individual MS4, that isn't something, and Tyler, you may expand on this, but the dashboard doesn't allow you to drill down to that level because a key function was wanting to maintain some anonymity for the survey respondents. So there's nothing here that allows you to drill down to a specific MS4 level. But Tyler, anything you would add there?
Yeah, I would just add that that's something that Second Nature specializes in, is data-driven sort of approaches to program management. So if you're interested in customized dashboards for your specific program, check out what Second Nature has to offer.
Yeah, I would just second that, and I put our website in there for everyone to take a look. That is what the Second Nature platform really at its core is all about, is providing kind of that dashboard level insight into programmatic performance across a number of different metrics, including not just permit driven metrics, but multi-benefit metrics from a social, economic, environmental equity standpoint.
Great. Thanks a lot, Tyler and Jason. And next, I think we'll be turning it over to Tyler Carson to talk about some more details of budget information.
Yes, and as I get that set up, I'm just going to share the responses from the poll that we just did, and then I'll save the last one for after Tyler's presentation. I thought it was great to see that a majority of you said that you would use the dashboard a few times a year, so that's wonderful. Sorry, Tyler, just getting it set up here.
No worries.
I had one too many things open on my screen here. All right, there you go.
Great, thank you. Okay, hello everyone. My name's Tyler Carson. I work at Arcadis, where I lead the local practice for stormwater and green infrastructure in the New York City area. I was really fortunate to be a part of the MS4 Survey group this year, so I want to say a quick thank you to WEF and Rebecca and the entire team for that opportunity. Today, I'm going to go and do a little bit of a deeper dive into some of the MS4 survey budget data to see what other insights that we can tease out from there. So 3 parts to the deep dive here. We're going to talk very briefly about the goals, go through the methods of the deep dive analysis, and then talk through some of the results. Okay, so the goals here, we had a really good segue question about looking at the data on a per capita basis, and that is exactly what we're trying to do with this analysis. Why do we want to do that? Well, it's going to help us make comparisons of budgets between the different size communities, right? If it's on a per person basis. We'll hopefully be able to provide some insight on the potential range of fees for stormwater utilities, whether you're creating a stormwater utility or you have one. And then third is the report talks a little bit about the budgets and scaling up those budgets nationwide based on the communities, the MS4 communities themselves. This per capita analysis allows us to do something similar once we have those numbers and kind of then cross-check it with some of the report values. Okay, so diving into the methods, the first thing we need for the dollars per person is the budgets. And so I'm going to go over this slide briefly. Seth already touched on these 3 questions in more detail as part of the overall report overview. But just to say them again, there's 3 general questions around the budget data. What is your annual program budget? Is there any additional money that is spent on stormwater from other sources? And then do you have an annual budget gap? So a few things that we're going to use these questions to help understand. The first is the total annual funding for that community, which would be the annual program budget plus the money from other sources. And then we're going to take a look at the total annual need, which is the total funding plus whatever the MS4 community has identified as their budget gap. Out of all the responses, there are 434 that have exact values for all three of these questions. So if there are any responses that say that they don't know, or it's blank, or there's a range, those responses were excluded from this particular analysis. Okay, and then on the population data side, so we do have a question in the survey. Again, Seth went through this about the population that your organization serves. I'm showing the different categories for that survey question underneath of it. These are great for kind of binning the MS4 communities by sizes for the general analysis. And then for this analysis, we went into a bit more detail and tried to pull out exact population data. So what we did is the survey responses give us the town, county, city, and we went and looked up what the population of those areas are from either census data or a good old-fashioned Google search and Wikipedia. We grabbed those exact numbers, and then we compared them to what the survey respondent says was their population category. If the numbers were well off, meaning it was outside of, if the exact number we pulled from online was outside of the category that they responded to significantly, those responses were also excluded. And so at the end of the day, we end up with 407 data points to take a look at, where you have all of the budget and the population data that you need to look at these on a per capita basis. Okay, so then in terms of the outputs, I mentioned before we have these 407 responses, and for each response, we have $1 per person that reflects the total annual funding, the annual budget gap, and then the total annual need. And then what we did, just so that we could evaluate those a little bit further, is we further binned those and categorized them based on the population size. So we had 272 responses for communities less than 50,000 people, 115 responses between 50 and 500,000, and then 20 responses for communities that are 500,000 or more. On the next slide, we're going to be taking a look at the data, and what we've done is for each of these three different population categories, we're able to pull out the quartiles of the dollars per person for each of the three budgets, the averages, as well as the cumulative distribution plot, so you can kind of see what's happening in between the quartiles. Now, I think before we dive in, I just want to quickly caveat some things, right? So the first thing is that this analysis is using a smaller subgroup of the total responses that we've seen before, some of the numbers, right? Because we're requiring the communities to have all three of those budget questions answered with an exact number. You know, maybe one of the other things here just to note is, right, some cities maybe have a smaller portion of the total city that the MS4 serves, so there could be some variability in the numbers that we pulled online versus what the MS4 actually serves in reality. There are some cases here where we had a response that was really on the border of the 500,000 or 50,000 person threshold, and you know, the exact number was just over, and then what the respondent said was just under. We tried to keep as many of those as we could that seemed reasonable, but depending on what's in or out of there, right, you may get some different numbers. And so just want to, you know, just caveat here that the numbers aren't perfect, but hopefully are useful in terms of gleaning some high-level takeaways. All right, and with that, we'll jump in. So this first slide here is on the total annual funding. I'm just going to tee up on the right side the information we're providing. So in the table there, you see a row for each of the 3 population categories. And then you see the annual dollars per person for the 25th, 50th, and 75th percentile, as well as the average. And that includes all the responses within that population category. And then, as I said before, we also are looking at the cumulative distribution plot. So you can get a feel for what that curve looks like, what's happening in between each of those percentiles. And that's showing, obviously, the total annual funding, dollars per person versus the cumulative responses. Okay, so a few maybe highlights from the data on the right. The first is, obviously, you can tell the wide range of per capita funding, right? From, if you're looking at the 25th to 75th percentile, that funding ranges roughly from $5 to $50 per person. And this really speaks to that wide range of program needs and drivers, right? It's come up a couple times, just what the local regulatory and permit requirements are. The second takeaway here is that the average funding on the right side, you can see that's actually closer to the 75th percentile than it is the median. And so you can get a sense that the tail end of the higher numbers, there's a wide tail on it. That figure I've had to cut off at $200. You can see none of those lines are at 100% cumulative responses. They extend on, but if I show it all the way out, you can't really see any of the details. But just to give you a sense, I think the highest funding per capita was around $600 per person. Third takeaway here is that overall, the MS4 communities that are less than 50,000 people have lower levels of per capita funding in the lower percentiles, the 25th to the 50th. But then they kind of catch up at the tail end from having some really high values. Some of that may be just some of the variability in some of the really small MS4 communities that, you know, maybe just have really high per capita numbers on the tail end that's driving that up. But from the 25th and 50th, you can get a sense that overall the per capita funding is a bit lower there. And then maybe the alternative for the larger communities here of 500,000 or more than 500,000 is that if you look at the 25th percentile, where you see $4 and $6 for 50 to 500,000, and then it jumps up to 17 for the larger MS4 communities, right? So it seems that they have a higher level of baseline funding. Okay, second slide here. Now we're moving on to the annual budget gap. Again, the same table and distribution plot. Some highlights from this, right? If we look at the range again for the 25th to 75th percentile, the budget gap is anywhere from $0 to $30 per person. These are all annual numbers. I'll just state again, I know it's on there a couple times. Second highlight here is that the budget gaps, if you compare between I'll say mid-size, the fifth, which is the 50 to 500,000, and the larger communities greater than 500,000 people, are relatively similar. So in the 50th percentile, it's $1 to $3, and in the 75th, it's 12 to 17. And then again, alternatively, if you look at the smaller MS4 communities, less than 50,000 people, those numbers jump up. So a larger budget gap per person there for some of the smaller MS4 communities. Okay, and then at the bottom, this we alluded to this a little bit earlier, but that kind of cross-check for the budget gaps. If you take the averages on the side and you scale those up to the U.S. population, the budget gap for the U.S. is somewhere around 5 to 15 billion, depending on which exact value you select, and that aligns well with the MS4, the larger MS4 survey, which was estimating the total budget gap at 8.5 billion. All right, and then our last metric here that we're looking at, this is now taking the total annual funding plus the estimated annual budget gap to come up with the total annual need. And now a few highlights here. Again, the range for the 25th to 75th percentile is somewhere around $10 to $90 per person. Again, it's a fairly large range. The baseline per capita needs are greater for the MS4 communities larger than 500,000. We kind of touched on this a little bit before. I think some of the responses of the total funding are probably driving the similar finding here in the total annual need, right? But the larger MS4 communities have a higher per capita need at the lower end at the 25th percentile. And then finally, interestingly, if you look at the 50th percentile across all three populations, the dollar per person in the total annual needs is relatively similar, 30 to let's say $40. And so you can see that even though the smaller MS4 communities had, the smaller MS4 communities had lower total annual budgets, but then greater annual budget gaps that they were estimating. So when we added the two together, they ended up being similar across the three different categories, which I thought was pretty interesting. And just to give another quick comparison here to another study, this is the survey that was conducted by Western Kentucky University. So in this study, they identified about 1,800 stormwater utilities in the US and 29 in Canada, across 41 states and DC. And they collected data, among other things, on the monthly fee for single family homes. So what I've done in the bottom right corner is I've pulled out, I took the monthly annual fee for the monthly average fee for the single family homes, and I've multiplied that up to be in annual dollars. So that's the first row that you see there, the annual dollars per household. And then I've kind of put two categories here, depending on whether you want to assume that there's 3 or 4 people to each single family home, and just divided the annual fee per home to put it in a per person basis, so that we could compare some of the findings from that study to what we've pulled out from the survey responses. So if you're looking at the West Kentucky University table at the bottom two rows, and comparing that, so these are, I don't know if I said this before, but these are actual fees from stormwater utilities. And so I thought it would be interesting to compare some of the actual fees to what some of the reported needs are in the MS4 survey, which is the table at the top. So a few takeaways here from the survey of annual fees. Again, the percentiles 25 to 75, that ranges from $36 to $86 a year per household. And then again, if you compare it on a per person basis, it looks like the current fees, again, depending on which percentile you look at, depending on what your assumption is as the number of people per household, but let's say just in generally, the stormwater utility fees look to be about 30 to 60% of the total needs that we were able to tease out from the survey responses. So I thought that was pretty interesting there. I think I'm right at my time, or just over, and that's the last slide.
Excellent. Thanks, Tyler. As folks have questions, either specific, we do have some time remaining in the webcast. If folks have questions for Tyler on what he was just presenting on the funding needs and budgets, or for any of our speakers or any of the topics that we covered, again, please feel free to reach out using the question feature. And I believe we also have one more poll question that we will get to now that folks have seen an overview of all the various aspects of the MS4 survey. So we do have one question that has come in. Do you have a sense of how many respondents have stormwater utility fees in place? You're on mute, Tyler.
Thank you. No, not that I was able to tease out directly from the responses.
Yeah, I don't recall that was a specific question that we asked. But again, one of the things, and this will be a part of the post webcast survey. If there are questions that you all have that you think may be interesting to capture from future surveys, we'd welcome you to share those. So. All right, and then another question, have there been other thoughts on how to look at these, including phase 1 versus phase 2 per capita? Assuming that's in relation to the cost and budget information.
Yeah, I didn't get a chance to separate them out. One of the challenges I think we ran into, particularly in that bin of the 500,000 or more, is that we only had 20 responses there. You could probably say most of those will be the phase 1s, right? But we wouldn't want to break that down much further than that. And maybe a similar comment for some of the other bins. If there's only 1 or 2 responses, let's say, from some of the categories, it be a bit hard there. But it's definitely something. At least now I'm interested in kind of taking a look at a little bit further.
All right. Any other questions? I guess maybe a follow-up comment on that. The person asking the question commented that they believe the phase 1 was cut off at 100,000 plus. Yeah, we'll get ready to pull up our final poll question. As others have questions or comments, feel free to add those using the question feature. And I guess, Tyler, a question for you, or maybe a comment for you. I mean, I think one of the things that in what you presented really helps to demonstrate is the substantial needs, for MS4s and how that relates to kind of their current funding levels. And I know as we talk, as we've talked through the course of the survey and various stormwater efforts, that's always a hot topic. Is what are those needs? What is the funding associated with them? As Seth mentioned earlier, this survey allowed stormwater to be included in the ASCE report card, which was a great milestone. And I know it's something, I guess I'd encourage folks, because of that interest, to stay tuned for other Stormwater Institute and WEF events kind of covering these topics, because it is, there are a lot, that's a big part of the survey, is understanding where those needs and interests are, and certainly funding is a big part of that. So thanks a lot, Tyler, for sharing that. All right, Rebecca, do we want to pull up the final poll? Excellent.
Sure, yeah. So it's how is the dashboard most useful to you? And after hearing Tyler Carson's presentation, maybe just thinking as a whole about the survey and how it's useful to you.
Yeah, while folks are answering that. Hopefully, some of this is similar to some of the questions that we asked earlier, but hopefully everyone has a better understanding now of what all is covered by the survey, the dashboard, and the various elements that we presented. And again, certainly thank you all for tuning in today to learn more about all of those efforts.
Definitely. We have about 60% of the audience have voted now. I'll go ahead and close that out. And interesting. So compare my community to similar, which was high on the first one. Better understand the breadth of MS4s nationally, and examine funding needs.
Yeah, no, this is really interesting, and thank you all for that input. All of the input that you all provide will help us to craft future MS4 survey efforts, and this is certainly helpful. And I think fits with some of what we had hoped to see. Certainly hope that there's a lot of value and functionality in. We talked about this a bit earlier. Understanding where your MS4 fits in the broader context. And other communities that may be similar, and perhaps some opportunities to collaborate, or just know that others are facing some of the same challenges that you are, while also understanding that breadth and diversity across MS4s nationally. Several of these really ranking high MS4 funding needs. Again, I think, and Tyler gave a good deeper dive into what some of those needs are, but certainly something that many of us are aware of and expect to continue to evolve in the future. And then also, was not necessarily a major focus of the presentation here today, but part of the value of this MS4 survey is understanding how those things may change over time, and something that WEF and those participating will continue to try to look at moving forward as this initiative evolves and we gather new data sets to look at some of those trends. All right. Rebecca, do you want to, I guess, wrap us up?
Sure. Yeah, I'm not seeing any more questions that have come in. So just again, I know we've said it a few times, but I really do want to emphasize that we thank you if you provided a response to the survey. That really does make this all possible. And a big thank you to our MS4 work team that puts together the questions, reviews the reports, goes through all the data, and that this iteration was chaired by Scott Taylor. And of course, a big thank you to our partners, the National Municipal Stormwater Alliance and Second Nature Software. And then this is everyone's contact information. If you need to reach out to any of us, please feel free to do that. And again, the website link where you can download the report and dashboard. So thank you again to all of our speakers. I really appreciate your participation today, going through everything. Someone just asked a question, are we able to submit information at this time? The 2020 survey is now closed, but we will be doing another survey in 2022. So be on the lookout for that. If you're interested in getting involved in developing those questions, please feel free to let me know. So again, thank you to our speakers. Thank you for calling in today. We really appreciate your participation. Have a good afternoon.